to present a special program every fall since 2012. This year we finally decided to give it a name, so we decided on the Fall Forum. So if you hear that in the future, you will know that this is the kind of presentation we're referring to. In the past, we've covered a variety of topics. We've covered pelicans, Great Salt Lake, water in Utah, community science, trees and birds as a part of the tapestry of nature, and the future of the world's birds in the 21st century. This year, we return to Great Salt Lake and its sister saline lakes in the west. Our presenters are from National Audubon's Saline Lakes program and the Gilbert Sanctuary. We are so fortunate and so happy to have these two programs here in Utah in Salt Lake City. The presence of these programs and the dedicated people associated with them have added a tremendous amount of credibility and energy to the local efforts to save the Great Salt Lake ecosystem and all its biological treasures. We're very excited to be able to feature the amazing work these people do every day to increase the understanding of and to motivate the powers that be to preserve Great Salt Lake, this unique feature that dominates the state and indeed the West. I'm going to hand off the mic here to Max, but before I do, I'd just like to thank Jamie Butler and Westminster College again this year for being such great partners who work with us every year to bring these programs to you. Max.
Can everyone hear me? On behalf of the Saline Lakes program and the Gilbert Sanctuary staff that you will be hearing from tonight, we would like to thank Great Salt Lake Audubon and Great Salt Lake Institute for organizing this event and providing us with this amazing venue, so thank you. We have a wonderful lineup for you guys tonight of presenters. First, we're going to hear from Brian Tavernia, our Saline Lakes ecologist. Brian is going to share with you guys some of the science work that he and our national science team have been undertaking. Next, we will hear from Marcelle Shoop, the Saline Lakes program director. Marcelle is going to do an overview of some of the Saline Lakes related policy work. We are delighted tonight to have with us Heidi Hoven and Ella Sovensen, our Gilbert Sanctuary managers. Heidi has a presentation looking at some of the ongoing research on macroinvertebrates that they're performing out on the sanctuary. And then we'll wrap things up with a lovely poetic reading by Ella. We will have a brief question and answer session after everyone's finished with their presentations. We'll get up here, we've got a mic we can move around. So if you could, please hold your questions until everyone's finished. And before I turn the time over to Brian, I'd like to give you just a brief overview of our program. The Saline Lakes program began in 2017. In that same year, National Audubon released its Water and Birds in the Arid West report. And this report looked in depth at the existing scientific literature and about 50 years of historic bird data. And one of the main focuses was looking at this network of saline lakes and their associated wetlands that are dotted throughout the Great Basin. In this report, we learned that these saline lakes and their wetlands support globally significant populations of many bird species, including 99% of the North American eared grebe population, close to 90% of the global Wilson's phalarope population, and greater than 50% of the American avocets. We learned that this network of ecosystems are critically important to shorebirds. Millions of migratory shorebirds use these lakes and wetlands as stopover sites during their annual spring and fall migrations to rest and refuel. In the report, we learned that there has been close to a 70% decline in shorebird populations since 1973. And of our 9 priority saline lake ecosystems in the West, At least 5 of them have shown a 50 to 95% reduction over the last 150 years due to things such as climate change, drought, and water diversions. I think that the findings of this report really highlight the importance of these lakes to birds, but it really points out the importance of really taking our time and acting in a way as shouldn't wait. We should act now and make sure that we do what we can to protect these set of ecosystems. So with that, our program's vision is healthy saline lake ecosystems with reliable water supplies to sustain birds and people. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the evening.
Thanks, Max, for the lead. Oh, sorry for the difficulties here right now. But as Max mentioned, I'm Brian Tavernia. I'm the Saline Lakes ecologist with the Saline Lakes program. And I'm pleased to have you here this evening and have the opportunity to share with you some of the work we've been doing here at Great Salt Lake as well as regionally in my first year with the program. So with that, I think I'll just dive right in and share with you that a lot of birds are so closely adapted to life on the water that for them, water is life. And you can tell that in a lot of different ways. You can see it in their morphology. If you take a look at the shape of that ruddy duck in the upper left-hand image, you can see that stiff tail that it uses as a rudder and stabilizer while it forages underwater. You can see it in their behavior. The lower left is a pair of western grebes that are showing their rushing behavior where they can run for up to 60 feet across the water surface. It's part of their courtship, how they select a mate. You can also see it in their physiology. On the right-hand side, we have a Wilson's phalarope. This is a species that returns every fall to the saline lakes, including Great Salt Lake, to fatten up on brine shrimp and brine flies, molt, and to get ready for a pretty long southward journey, perhaps as far south as Argentina. So, given how closely these and other birds are adapted to water, it's not surprising that they're sensitive to human-caused disturbances of water quantity, quality, and timing. And as Max mentioned, our vision with the Saline Lakes program is to have healthy saline lakes with reliable water supplies to sustain human populations and bird populations. My role with the program as a scientist is to help us think critically about how much water the birds need, when, and where, to allow them to be successful in their breeding attempts, to prepare for migration, as well as to survive the overwinter. And we need to be able to ask and answer those questions at multiple scales and at multiple points throughout the year. And to illustrate that, I'm showing you on the right-hand side a figure that represents the annual cycle of the eared grebe, a species that's pictured on the lower left-hand. And this is a species that you can see starts out breeding in the upper left-hand or upper right-hand corner of this image in the mid-continent of North America before moving through the saline lakes on its fall migration, represented by the red arrows. Eventually, they end up, most of them, in the Gulf of California where they spend the winter, and then return through the saline lakes in the spring, represented by the green arrows to their breeding areas. So, for this species and others like it to undergo these types of long-distance movements, we need to know how much water, when, where, and what quality of water is needed for these birds at every point along the journey in each season. And part of the challenge also is that all these species that are dependent on saline lakes don't require necessarily the same habitat conditions. So not only do we need to be able to answer these questions throughout their annual cycles, but we then need to be able to balance their competing needs for habitat to be able to maintain them as part of this network and as part of the biological landscape that we appreciate. So how do you start to address those types of questions about how much water, when, and where for these birds? We need data that's telling us what birds are present, what bird species are present, when and where, as well as in what numbers, and how are those numbers changing across time. And here at Great Salt Lake, one source for that type of data is the Great Salt Lake Ecosystem Program. This is a program that's part of the Division of Wildlife Resources. They've been conducting annual counts for 24 survey units that you can see pictured here on the right-hand side annually since 1997. We entered into a data sharing agreement with them in the fall of 2018 to help them standardize their data across the 21-year period from 1997 up to 2017, and then to ask a series of related questions. First, we wanted to know how counts were changing for individual bird species across that full 21-year time period. And then we were interested in learning whether or not those changing counts were related to changes in the amount of water flowing into the lake, as well as the lake's elevation. And this body of work is still in progress, but I'm going to share with you just a snippet of our results here tonight, preliminary results here tonight, to give you some sense of the type of information we'll be producing. And for that reason, I'll be focusing on the American avocet, which is a common shorebird species here at Great Salt Lake, and pictured down on the lower right-hand side. What you're seeing is two separate maps. The one on the left corresponds to survey results from April, May, so typically when they're on their spring migration. And the one on the right corresponds to July and August, when they're migrating back during the fall. And what you can tell, just by looking at these two maps of those 24 units that I talked to you about earlier, is that, well, let me back up for a second and mention the color coding here, because this is important. So the way that these units are color coded on this image indicates what's been happening with avocet counts in each one of the units. So if you see a unit that's either closer to the red end of the spectrum or the orange end of the spectrum, that's a unit where avocet numbers have been decreasing over time. If it's closer to the blue or green end of the spectrum, avocet numbers have been increasing. And so back to the point I was going to make earlier, which is, if you take a look at this map, it's pretty clear that there's variability in what you're seeing with avocet numbers over time, depending on where you look at the lake. So let's just zoom in on 3 sites that I picked fairly arbitrarily for the point of the discussion tonight. And they're located around Farmington Bay. And 2 of those units, you can see that based on the trends analyses we've done so far, you've got an 18.5% increase. That's year over year in avocet numbers, or a 13.2% increase. So we've got increasing numbers in some locations, but in the 3rd unit I've selected, on the southern end of Farmington Bay, we've actually seen a decrease, 7.7% per year. So why is it important to dig in and understand that numbers aren't changing in the same way everywhere for the avocet? Well, if we go farther and investigate what the mechanisms are, what habitat conditions are improving in some areas, what habitat conditions may be deteriorating in others, that may provide insight into the types of conservation and management actions we need to pursue to benefit the avocets in terms of allowing their populations to be stable or potentially increase here at Great Salt Lake. So as I mentioned, this is a body of work that's still in progress. The next steps we're going to be taking is to look to see if there are groups of species that are showing similar trends. So are there groups that are increasing? Are there groups that are decreasing? Are there groups that are stable? We're going to be taking a couple of different approaches to that. We'll be looking at shorebirds, waterbirds, and waterfowl. We'll also be looking to see if groups based on foraging techniques have similar trends. So foraging techniques like plunge diving birds, such as the forester's tern in the upper image there, versus species that tend to stalk and strike, like the black-crowned night heron that you see pictured down below. Another approach we're taking is to look at migration distances. So do species that migrate a long distance versus a short distance tend to increase, decrease, or remain the same? As I mentioned earlier, we're also interested ultimately in looking at whether these changing counts are related to the amount of water coming into the lake or the lake's elevation. And examples of the types of discussions we can inform once we finish with this body of work is things like thinking about what species might be conservation or management priorities, or informing updates of those priorities at Great Salt Lake, and also assessing project impacts. So if you've got a proposed project that might impact the amount of water flowing into the lake or lake elevation, and we find a relationship between the counts and those variables, we can provide some assessment of how we expect this project to impact counts for those bird species. So, but here we've reached the point of the talk where I'm going to step back and take a broader perspective and point out that ultimately what happens with these birds depends not only what occurs here at Great Salt Lake, but what occurs at a much larger scale and across longer time scale, or across longer time periods rather. And to drive that point home, I'm actually going to pull out an image here from the report that Max referenced earlier, Audubon's 2017 Water and Birds in the Area West report. And what this shows on the left-hand side is movements through the Great Basin on spring migration on the right-hand side, during fall migration. The important take-home point here is that we see connections between the saline lakes as the birds are moving through the Great Basin. So you can think about it as the birds aren't using a single lake, they're using a chain of lakes as they're moving through. And each lake representing a link in that chain. And it could be that there is a weak link in the chain where you have habitat conditions that have deteriorated. Maybe there's a fairly dry or drought conditions occurring, or there's an upstream diversion that is preventing some water from flowing into the lake. That has really caused habitat conditions to maybe go down a hill at that particular point. And that might be constraining the bird's population as it's moving through the Great Basin. What we're interested in as a program is taking a prospective look at what might happen in terms of human population growth, land use and water use change in the future, climate change, and what do those changes mean about where you see the weak links in this chain and how severe those weak links might be in the future. And in order to be able to address that broader question, we need to ask and answer a set of related questions that I'm going to walk you through now. First, we need to start out with a good understanding of how water quantity, quality, and timing are going to change for the saline lakes and their associated wetland habitats in the future. On the left-hand side, I'm showing you a satellite image of the Great Salt Lake. What it represents is the time period from the mid-1980s up to 2015. And based on the color that you see, that's how frequently water occurred in different areas of the lake. So if you've got a deeper blue color, water is more often present over that 30-year time period. If it's a lighter purple color, water is less frequently present over that time period. And all I need to illustrate with this is that water is dynamic here at Great Salt Lake. It's been dynamic in the past, it's going to remain but dynamic in the future. We need to understand what those dynamics are going to look like. What does that mean for how water quantity, quality, and timing are going to change? Not only here at Great Salt Lake, but across all the saline lakes in this network that we're concerned with as a program. So after we've asked and answered that question, we need to gain an understanding of how will those changing water resource conditions of quantity, quality, and timing impact habitat for the birds and the resources such as aquatic invertebrates that they have available to them. Now, there's a lot of different dimensions you could look at with respect to habitat. I'm just going to pick one fairly easy dimension to talk about here tonight, but clearly if you change the amount of water and the timing of water coming into the lake, you might impact how much water is in a suitable water depth for a species to use and the time of year in which that habitat is available for them to use. And that's pretty clear that there's a relationship between certain species and different water depths. And that's illustrated just by looking at quickly these pictures where you see a species such as the snowy plover in the upper right-hand side, another species such as marbled godwit, and then finally, lower right is the common goldeneye. It's pretty clear just looking at these images that these are species that are tied to different water depths. They rely on different water depths for success, to successfully meet their needs. So how are water quantity, quality, and timing going to change in the future? What does it mean for habitat and resources for the birds? The third and final question before we talk about where weak links might develop in the future that we need to address is how do birds move between the saline lakes? As I indicated earlier, we do have some information about that based on the data sets like the USGS's bird banding laboratory where they ring birds and recover them in other locations. But largely, this is a knowledge gap for many species and in many locations. And one way that there's a lot of different ways we could address this knowledge gap, but I'm just going to mention one of them here tonight, and that's modus. Modus is Latin for movement, and essentially this is an ongoing effort that is being driven by researchers and agency professionals who are basically joining this effort and putting up sedentary radio telemetry towers at various locations, a lot of times concentrated in North America, but they're spread globally. I put up a map here of where the MODIS towers have been recently located. But those towers, once they're in place, will detect when birds move past them. And if they're placed in the right locations in the Great Basin at these saline lakes, they offer a pathway forward to get an idea of how the birds are moving from one lake to the next. However, you can see, just by taking a look at the map, at the moment, we still have a ways to go before we have that type of coverage in the Great Basin and could potentially use this approach to address our knowledge needs. So I'm going to bring all those pieces together now and address what was the overarching question that I started with, which is, where are those weak links going to be, potentially, in the saline lakes network in the future, and how severe might they be? So, this is a hypothetical example of how we could approach addressing this question if we answer all three of those. And I'm just going to build up to addressing where and how severe the links might be. So remember, our first two questions were, how will water resources and habitat change for the birds in the future? And I've answered that for you pretty simply here. I've got a set of three circles. You can think about them as three separate saline lakes, with the size of the circle representing potentially the quality of the habitat that's present and the amount of habitat that's present. And so if we just look at lakes 1 and 3, the top and bottom here, you can see you've got a lot of habitat, a lot of good quality habitat present there. Hypothetical lake number 2 though, we've got a smaller amount of habitat, and the habitat is of poor quality. So graphically, just representing the answer to those first two questions of how water quantity and habitat are going to change in the future. What was the third question? That's right, how will birds move among the saline lakes? And so, pretty intuitive here, filling in that blank for us with arrows in terms of moving from lakes, starting in lake 1, moving in 2, and then the 3. So how does this really help us answer the question of where and how severe those links will be, or weak links might be? Well, in this hypothetical example, you can imagine the bird starting out in lake 1, and I've pulled out an image of a dense flock of eared grebes as my hypothetical starting flock of birds. They've got a lot of resources, high quality resources that they have in that lake. They can build up the fat reserves they need. They can survive well to make the journey from lake 1 to lake 2. But as they reach lake 2, you have a decline in the amount of resources and the quality of resources available. There are more birds piling into that lake, perhaps exhausting food resources pretty quickly. They're not able to prepare necessarily as well for the next leg of their journey or survive as well. And so you can imagine that fewer individuals either survive at lake 2 or prepare well enough to make it to lake 3. And we could see a drop in their population because of that weak link in this hypothetical set of chain of saline lakes here. And I've represented that pretty graphically and drastically here, going from that dense flock that we started with to just a single pair of eared grebes. So ultimately, that's the type of assessment we hope to be able to do at a regional scale when thinking about the saline lakes as a collective whole and their ability to support birds. Okay, so final slide here is just a little piece to speak to what you could potentially do as a member of the community to contribute to efforts to address big questions like the ones I've posed here tonight, not only for the saline lake ecosystems, but birds and their conservation more generally. And from a scientific perspective, which is how I'm going to approach this, I would encourage you to think about becoming community scientists, which essentially means you volunteer as part of a large program that may be covering a pretty large geographic area that's long term, and you go out and you collect data on birds and their habitat. And scientists like myself can use that data set then to really ask and answer some of these large-scale important questions when it comes to conserving birds across large areas like the Great Basin and long time periods. There are a lot of opportunities to get involved in community science programs. Nationwide, there's Cornell's eBird program. You can, as you're out bird watching, keep track of the number of birds you're seeing and give it to Cornell, and they make that publicly available. There's Audubon's Christmas bird counts, USGS's breeding bird surveys, and then locally, there are programs offered through Tracy Aviary. The local Audubon chapters can also facilitate your participation in some of these national community scientist programs. And I want to say, and I just want to quickly illustrate that sometimes you can participate in these programs and feel like you may not necessarily be having an impact, but that's not true. One example of that is from the Central Valley of California. What I'm showing you here is a set of images from a paper that was published in 2017 where they took eBird data, which you see on the left, and modeled the abundance of shorebirds and overlaid that on where you might find water resources available when the shorebirds were passing through. And that enabled them to identify gaps where you had a lot of shorebirds but not enough water resources to meet their needs and to move to address those gaps. So you can really have a concrete outcomes for bird. You can contribute to concrete outcomes for birds and their habitat by participating in these community science programs. More generally, I would just encourage you to stay informed about issues around saline lakes. We have a great website that we're working to make even better. We've got a newsletter. There's a Great Salt Lake Issues Forum that happens biannually, usually in May. And obviously keep informed by keeping abreast of news and information coming out of Great Salt Lake Audubon, as well as the Great Salt Lake Institute. With that, I thank you for your attention. I look forward to taking questions from you later, and I'll turn it over to Marcelle.
I think that Max and Brian did a great job setting up some of the discussion on policy. And you'll hear this from us over and over again about the importance of this network of saline lakes. And so if you leave here tonight, if there's one thing that you walk away with, it's understanding that Great Salt Lake is part of this really important set of habitats across the West, and we need to try to protect it. And the more we can raise awareness about what needs to be done at that landscape level, the more we can try to achieve those efforts that Brian described on a science basis, understanding how much water we need, when, where, for what species. And that's not something that Audubon can do on its own. We've got to do that as part of a much broader, wider collaborative program. And therefore, right now, there's always a hesitation for me to talk about something we haven't accomplished yet, but what we're trying to work on is really raising awareness of the importance of that network of lakes. And doing that in part by trying to coordinate with federal water and fish and wildlife agencies. So USGS is a particularly important partner in a program like this. And they already have a lot of good information and knowledge about these lake systems and what's happening with water. But we also need to do that at the state levels. And particularly when you look at the challenge we have at a landscape level, every one of these lakes is subject to, well, there are multiple states in the Great Basins, at least 4, with different water rights, different ownerships of the lake and the water. And how things are managed locally is not something that is easy to address if you're trying to focus at a programmatic level. It's not like sage grouse where you can go in and hopefully the Forest Service or BLM will enact a program large scale. So part of what we're looking at is what are the kind of policy level levers we can use, even just in an appropriations sense, to try to create a programmatic effort where we can really advance coordinated management and conservation actions. So on that, I would say stay tuned. It's something that we're working on, and we look forward to meeting with you and hearing you talk about the importance of all these lakes in the West. So with that, I want to focus on Great Salt Lake, which again, I sort of view as the centerpiece of this network of lakes. But interestingly enough, one of the legislators I first showed this map to said to me, that looks like the Delta hub map. And it kind of does, just right there at Great Salt Lake, one of the big hubs. So I know that many of you have seen this graph before. This is a graph created by Wayne Ward-Spa, working with Craig Miller at the state and many other authors in a report about what's happening at Great Salt Lake. And what we see is that over more than 150 years, the lake is on a sustained downward trend. And more than 40%, I think it's 40% of the flows have decreased and 11-foot drop. So that's pretty serious. But we also know that the lowest recorded level was in 1963. And we know that the lake has bounced back over time. But now we're facing a situation where we're at very low levels. And in fact, the USGS colleague put it to me this way. Since the early 60s, the three lowest years with low lake levels have been in the last 10 years. So that says to me there is an urgency to trying to address this issue. How do you get policymakers and others to feel that same sense of urgency? Because sometimes it's really much easier to act when you're in a crisis situation than it is when you've got time to make decisions and choices. So part of that effort that we're doing is trying to drive, working with others to try to drive the information coming in to help us understand what the consequences of inaction can be. And we're very fortunate in this community to have the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council, which is tasked with advising administrative and legislative bodies on the sustainable use, development, and protection of Great Salt Lake. So they've developed a body of work that's very helpful, including a report on the health of Great Salt Lake, a report on showing that the economic output of Great Salt Lake is $1.32 billion annually. And they've also developed a list of more than 70 actions that was stakeholder generated about ways to get water to Great Salt Lake. Recently, this year, they're producing 3 important reports. One is on the consequences of drying lakes around the globe. This report is really important in helping bring together what's happening around it uses 8 lakes as an example, including Lake Urmia in Iran, the Aral Sea, Salton Sea, Owens Lake, and showing, it's not theoretical what can happen to a community and to a region if these lakes dry up. And so this report kind of puts it all in context. And again, the reasons for these lakes drying up are really not that much different than what we're concerned about here at Great Salt Lake. Upstream diversions, or diverting water away for other uses, drought, and climate change. This report is well worth a read, but there's a summary if you don't want to read a long report. If you go to Great Salt Lake Advisory Council's website, you can see all the reports on their activities page. This really looks at loss of fish and birds, the dust hazards for public health. I mean, places like Lake Urmia, esophageal cancer is a really huge risk. Many livelihoods have been lost at these lakes in these areas from farming and recreation and tourism and fisheries industries. And the other thing that you see from looking at these other examples is that, when these dry up, there's a lot of dust coming off of these lakes usually. And you can try to do mitigation in some fashion, but what you find is that mitigation is very costly, and you only get a return on a portion of the benefits that the lake once served. So for example, at Owens Lake in California, it's anticipated that by 2025 they'll spend $3.6 billion or more just on managing the dust, and they're doing it in ways that include gravel, deep tilling, and luckily, in some cases, habitat for shorebirds. But again, we do not have the entire Owens Lake. So the next study that the Great Salt Lake Advisory Council commissioned that came out this year is a study that shows, looks at what are the potential costs that we might incur as a society if Great Salt Lake levels decline to serious levels. And they looked at 3 different types of costs. Certain costs they could monetize and actually come up with a number. There wasn't primary research for this study, but it did look at other studies. And again, it looked at the industries off the lake, but recreation, that includes birding and hunting and boating. They looked at health costs, largely from dust, and came up with an annual cost of some 6.6 million to 2.3 million annually. And they also looked at the loss of revenues to the ski industry. Now, there are other snow sports as well, but they calculated a cost annually based on what might happen and if you had a reduction in lake effect, but also if dust on snow causes earlier snow melt. So I won't go into these other types of costs, but interestingly enough, they did look at, we've seen at Salton Sea, property values have declined significantly. We could see property value reductions there. Who should care about that? Besides people that own those homes or the realtors that sell them, the local governments that generate property revenue from taxes. So those are kinds of things that we're seeing that can help inform policymakers about the costs. So when you look at the costs at large, and this table is just intended to be illustrative, looking at these types of costs, and as the lake drops, costs increase naturally. This study concluded that in terms of monetized costs, that potentially it could be 1.6 billion to 2.17 billion per year, and more than 6,500 lost positions. This is up to, this is like $25 to $32 billion over a 20-year period discounted. Okay, when you compare that, the magnitude of those costs to some of the other policy efforts that are trying to go on in terms of water conservation, that has important information. The third study, which I'm not going to go into too much because it's technically way over my head, but it is one that is, it's the Great Salt Lake Integrated Model. So they're looking at scenarios that could happen if certain things, if we baseline conditions, we continue to consume water the way we are, if we get really hot climate and we're really growing and we're not conserving water. So a range of scenarios. It's not predictive. It just says if this happens, this is the kind of outcome we expect. And population and land use are primary drivers, climate and water use conservation in the municipal, industrial, and agricultural industries. Key takeaways from that report that will help inform policy really are that changes at Great Salt Lake occur in decades, not in years in many respects. So everything we do today has an impact in 10 years, and we should be thinking that way. Scenarios suggest that we will see continuing declines in Great Salt Lake water levels. Climate variability is a key factor in that. And so when you look at that, it makes the challenge of addressing water supply that much harder and really starts to focus effort on what changes we do see if we improve our water conservation and water use and spread that use among what we're expecting as new population growth. This year we had some pretty interesting success with the legislature. Even though we're saying how do we make sure that people understand there's urgency, the awareness is there that there is a concern. And in 2014, there was a resolution that recognized the value of Great Salt Lake. This year, they've recognized that water is critical to Great Salt Lake and its wetlands, and that we need to have solutions. The legislature and governor are expecting a report back by 2020 on solutions and recommendations. So we hope that some of the policy mechanisms that are being developed now will play into that, but new ones as well. So if I just talk really quickly now, how am I doing on time? I've got your watch, Max, but I can't tell the time on it because it went silent, but that's okay, you're good. In any event, water savings, these are things I put in the water savings demand management category. We know that we've already seen a secondary water metering bill, and if you're not familiar with that, it's just that Utah has a lot of secondary water connections. These are connections where people pay for the water on their property tax bill, but it's not metered, and they can use pretty much as they want. And so what they found is when people put meters on these, even if they're not being charged, they start to understand, wow, I'm overwatering, I don't need this much water. And so it's driven up to maybe 25% reduction in water use. There's a desire to really beef up that when those requirements come into play. Right now it's on new construction, but there's a lot of existing secondary water metering that could be done, but it's expensive, but not nearly as expensive as a declining water levels at Great Salt Lake. I think they're looking at $189 million over 20 years. That's a lot cheaper than $1 or $2 billion a year. Agricultural water optimization, how can you improve the way agriculture uses water? Still have return flows that are important for the environment and other users, but maybe less evaporation or just other efficiencies. So there's an effort, a task force looking at that. And then we have the regional conservation goals coming out. And regardless of what your views are and whether those goals are strong enough or too strong, the fact of the matter is in order to get to those goals, it's going to require us to change the way we're using water. And that includes landscape changes, and secondary water metering, and even the way we use water in our homes as well. There are efforts afoot. We're working on a state water plan right now. This is coming from the Division of Water Resources. I anticipate this will be out after the first of next year, and it will be a 5-year plan with several actionable goals, many of which are really looking at ways to stretch our water supply. There's also a state water policy that's under discussion. Senator Stratton has put something out for discussion. It tracks to some degree the governor's 2017 recommendations on water strategy, but it doesn't track exactly, and so there's a lot of discussion about how to address that. That said, it does have a provision for Great Salt Lake, essentially parodying some of the language from the resolution. On the water sharing front, or what we call voluntary, flexible, temporary market mechanisms, there is likely to be legislation that's coming here on water banking, a way for, particularly in the agricultural industry, but others as well, to put their water in a bank where others can lease it on an annual or longer basis. That program actually would also consider uses for the environment as a beneficial use. So while that would take a lot of water to take care of Great Salt Lake, changing the way we think about ways to buy and sell and move water around and making that flexible where people can still retain their water rights is something that we think is going to help the lake in the long run. And again, just getting people to think that a beneficial use includes the environment is important as well. Split season uses is something similar to that, but it's not annually. It's you'd be able to portion off part of your irrigation, for example, only do the first 2 cuttings of alfalfa and not do a 3rd cutting, and if there's water in the system, be able to lease that to somebody else, maybe Trout Unlimited, for example. And then there's an effort to work on watershed councils, to set up watershed councils, and there may be a piece of legislation next year. I think they've really tried to work on that to make it very high level, not so prescriptive, where we might have a state or coordinating council, and then the individual watershed councils could develop organically. There is a Great Salt Lake room, they've actually defined where those watersheds are. There is a Great Salt Lake watershed that includes not only Great Salt Lake itself, but the 5 watersheds. With all these myself, I borrowed heavily from Representative Hawks on some of this in a presentation he just gave this week. But I've actually switched things up a little bit and talk about them as I think of them. But I think one of the things that we can think about in terms of future policy options are really ensuring that decisions that are made at the local or state level do include an assessment of impacts on Great Salt Lake and its wetlands, particularly where we have a pretty good idea we're going to see an impact. And that probably in some respects is the water rights area in particular. And so maybe one of the options there, and it's been discussed by Steve Clyde, who's got is a water lawyer with a lot of great ideas, is really defining criteria for public welfare, which is a statutory requirement already that the state engineer needs to consider. It's just that it's unclear what that includes. Another thing, Great Salt Lake or any of these other important areas, how do we pay for that? And is it a public benefit? And if so, and everybody agrees about that, who and how do we fund that? So those are some things that we can think about going forward, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Max. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions later.
Okay, so Gilbert Sanctuary is actually located at the southeast shore of Great Salt Lake. It's about 4 miles across from Antelope Island, and here I'm just going to briefly give you a glimpse of the multiple land and water transactions that have taken place over the last 27 years and still going to piece together what we call Gilbert Sanctuary. And one of the most recent transactions this year happened with Kennecott. And that was to arrange for a rent. Oh, there we go. To arrange for a rent-free lease that allows for Audubon to manage 3 Kennecott properties that you see in the turquoise up there, and as a part of the Gilbert Sanctuary. And this is over a large saline mudflat of 266 acres, at least part of the area is. And it's jointly owned by Kennecott, Audubon, and the Mitigation Commission, which holds the flowage easement for the area. And now this can be shallowly flooded without regard to property lines, creating productive shorebird habitat. Now this is great news for birds because, of course, birds and water pay no mind to property boundaries. So in this map, this is showing the different elevation levels. The darker blue tint are the higher elevation, and then as that leads down to the lighter colored areas, that's the lower elevation. And we love this map because it really gives you an idea of how water might flow or used to flow through the system and its ancient river formations, channels. And if it weren't for water control structures that we've put in place, it would pool and collect and concentrate salts and then evaporate away in some of the areas, but maybe flush some of those salts from some of the upper areas. So with the installment of these structures, we can effectively dam some of these water management units and largely retain the salts. And then we can also make the water sort of what we call backflow into some of these upper reaches, these wonderful back bays that the shorebirds love. And I might add that we have some of the last great macroinvertebrate habitat on Great Salt Lake at Gilmore, and that includes mudflats that are shallow and saline, shallowly flooded and saline. Gilmore Sanctuary is managed through an experimental approach. No cookbook exists that fits our unique Great Salt Lake shorebird management. Water strategies are implemented following an annual prescription based on sanctuary goals. The vegetation and the birds respond. We observe and document. We conduct 42 annual bird surveys, and at those times we record what the water is doing, what the water status regarding flooding or drying down or what's remaining relatively the same. And we also make an annual documentation of the vegetation distribution around these units that we manage. And in doing this, studying bird and vegetation responses gives us clues to how this complex, dynamic system functions, and it helps guide water strategies for the following year. But understanding the birds, the water regimes, and the vegetation is not enough. Here in these photos, you can see one striking difference where one is loaded with shorebirds while the other is pretty sparse, if not completely empty. And when we're at Gilmore Sanctuary, we're often confronted with looking at two systems that look exactly the same, and yet only one is attracting the birds, and we wonder why, and this is what is driving our current research. So understanding the macroinvertebrate prey base and their life cycles are crucial to manage water to synchronize availability of macroinvertebrates when the birds are present. And we realize that for shorebirds, these macroinvertebrates are the key. In other words, we're trying to promote, dare I say, friskiness and frolicking in the mudflats. And I'm forgetting. How do I? That's how do I? There we go. Okay, so I've got videos in here and I want you to see. I missed one already. But keep your eye on this little screen while I talk about why macroinvertebrates. They're highly nutritious and they're easily digestible protein. They're loaded with essential fatty amino acids and carbohydrates. And some provide a source of fresh water in a highly saline or dry environment, such as the ones that we have at Gilmore Sanctuary and all around Great Salt Lake. The macroinvertebrates are important to the birds because they help restore their energy reserves. And they also comprise a high percentage of the shorebird diet. These are tiger beetles, by the way. Sorry, the trigger is sensitive. So, when starting any scientific endeavor, one first looks to the literature to learn what is known. And in the Great Salt literature, much of it relies or focuses on open water habitat. And much less is known of shorebird diets in the Great Salt Lake saline wetlands. One study that was conducted by Dr. John Cabot at Weber State University was to learn about the diet of the American avocet and the black-legged stilts. And he found that the corixids, which are, you may know as water boatmen, and chironomids, which are the non-biting midges, composed a large percentage of the diet. But if you look at this list, it illustrates that there's quite a diverse group of insects that these birds also incorporate into their diet. Another study, which was a dissertation work piece by Bruce Knudsen at the University of Utah, conducted stomach content analysis of several other kinds of shorebirds because he wanted to know, his focus was on understanding deerfly habitat. And he did his work out at the Ambassador Duck Club, which is adjacent to the Gilbert Sanctuary. And he wanted to know if these birds were actually preying on these horseflies and dewflies. And those are the chrysops and the tabanidae, if you pick those out. But interestingly, his work also illustrates that the corixids and the chironomids are important for nearly all of the shorebirds he collected, as well as many taxa within the beetle groups. And then others as well, snails and seeds and dragonflies and so forth. So obviously there's a varied diet amongst the shorebirds. And what we're wondering is what conditions provide the best menu for such a diverse group of birds. One of the most important and probably the one that we can influence the most variables that affect macroinvertebrate availability to shorebirds is water. And within what we do with water, the timing of when it's present within the wetlands, the depth it occurs, which is important to shorebirds of different bill lengths and leg lengths, so that they can access their prey, and also the duration, the amount of time that the water is present in the wetlands can affect the success of the life cycles of the macroinvertebrates, whether they'll come to completion or not. And this is particularly important in these saline ephemeral wetlands that we have and manage. So the goal of our study and its objectives are to develop a protocol to better inform shorebird habitat management decisions, aka how to grow irresistible bugs at Gilmore. And to do this, we know we need an improved understanding of relationships between water management and macroinvertebrate response. And to get at that, we are collecting the biological and physical and water quality parameters that are co-located, taken at the same time and place, with the macroinvertebrate samples at sites that are actively foraged by shorebirds. Sorry, I've got to remember to make these things go. So our sampling design is following or tracking a dynamic system. And so these stars are just an example of two of the sites that we follow. And our sampling actually has to track the water as it recedes from the shoreline. And this is demonstrating an evaporative or evaporation trend within our Unit 1. And then we repeat these sampling events monthly between April and September while most of the shorebirds are with us. Then what we've really learned is that in the hydrological regime in these managed systems is actually quite complex because they're very affected by precipitation events, and temperature. And so, along with water levels being affected and dynamic, so is the salinity and other water quality parameters within a unit over time. And so this illustrates what we're actually looking for when we're tracking the water regimes. Is the unit actually flooding? Is the water sheet flowing through, depicted by this red line, to go to systems lower down in elevation to flood them first? And then once we have achieved those goals, we can block where our water control structure is and start flooding up this entire unit, and then start to backflood, as I mentioned before, where the water will rise up into these back bays. And then finally, water might be just drawing down, as you saw before, through evaporation. When we first get to a site, we characterize certain things. Initially, we take a standardized bird survey upon arrival, and then we document the shoreline vegetation structure, because this can be an indicator of adult macroinvertebrate habitat. And we document the percent cover of submerged vegetation or algae or benthic crust within the core, so the actual sediment that we're sampling. And that captures the water column and all the way through to the 10 centimeters into the sediment and all the macroinvertebrates that occur within. And then we document the shoreline topography, and in an attempt to see whether the slope and exposure may be affecting whether or not a site is suitable for foraging. We characterize the substrate, which is the sediment, and we take basic water quality parameters, you see listed there, and then, as I mentioned before, we document the hydrologic regime. So the sampling protocol was developed with, hopefully this isn't too noisy, I don't see the volume. But anyway, with the help of Dr. David Richards, who is a local macroinvertebrate specialist, and then also looking into the literature for what the standard methodology is, and then using a coring technique that I've used for many years, sampling aquatic vegetation out in the wetlands around Great Salt Lake. And we modified that a little bit and came up with a way to take the 10 centimeter cores I mentioned, and we go out to where the birds are actively foraging and sample in approximately the same water depth. Then we go through the sorting process where we remove the macroinvertebrates from the debris and sediment in the field, preserve them, and take them back to the lab to identify them down to the order or family level, and then we enumerate them. And down the road, we may look at optional variables that can tell us something about the biomass, the actual production of macroinvertebrates within the wetlands, or someone else can. And so far, we've identified up to 41 taxa with the help largely of Brett Marshall up in Montana, and then also we received some help from David Richards. And these are some of the most common that we are collecting out at Gilmore. You'll see these are what the midges look like, and some of you might recognize this red one. This is one of the most common of the midge types. And this is also a very common, the Carixid that I mentioned for the water boatman, just so you get a visual. But then you might recognize these names: caddisfly, damselfly. These are Daphnia, you may or may not know about those. They are found in very good water conditions, water boatmen, and then mayfly nymphs and dragonflies, and many, many more. When we're assimilating the data, this is just a subset of all the information that we're collecting. But the idea is to take these variables and try to help explain our species richness and numbers of macroinvertebrates per meter squared that we're getting. This is last year's data, and I've put in the specific conductivity and the salinity and the dissolved oxygen, as well as just general characteristics of the hydrology that we observed. And down here are the codes for the color codes that we have included, and that just describes the upland areas adjacent to the wetlands and also the aquatic vegetation that might occur or other structure that the macroinvertebrates might have. So when we look at samples in particular, some stand out, and like this one has a pretty low count compared to others. And even this small amount of information is telling me that, okay, first we have a low species richness and a very high salinity and specific conductivity. And to get a sense of what this number means, I've included a chart that shows what the approximate seawater specific conductivity is up here, 55,000. So you get a sense that this is really high, and indeed the practical salinity unit is high as well. Also, the dissolved oxygen is very low compared to some of these other sites, but plus this is just a very low figure. So that tells me that, well, let's look a little deeper, and maybe is the temperature very high as well? Is the water depth very, very shallow? And indeed they were. And it explains to me that this site was actually just pretty much nearly dry. There's just a skim of water on it. And so I wasn't surprised at all that this is all that was left, gone. And then this site also had a low number, but if you look at these parameters up here, the specific quantity, salinity, DO, they're perfectly fine. They're in the mid-range or even really great. So what's going on? Well, perhaps it's because the sample was taken from a flooded but bare area, and there's no structure for the macroinvertebrates to hide under or to forage. Maybe they're very, very visible and could have been grazed very, very easily. You know, there's a number of parameters, but at least that's one of them that stands out. So this is the kind of process we're going to be going through with our data to try to understand these kinds of ecological relationships. So other things that affect the diversity and availability of macroinvertebrates for shorebirds is trophic structure within the macroinvertebrate community. And in fact, the trophic structure really dictates the abundance and diversity of macroinvertebrates at a community level, particularly in saline habitats that we have. Also affecting these things is the tolerance of the macroinvertebrates to various limiting factors. Now, macroinvertebrates have been shown to, they're found across all wetland types of Great Salt Lake, and quite a diverse group too. But I put in this photo in the lower left corner to illustrate what a dynamic system we really have out at Gilbert Sanctuary and wetlands around Great Salt Lake, and that is that the water level might be fine one day for the existence of these macroinvertebrates, and you come back the next, and all that's left is the evidence. You see just thousands probably of shorebird footprints in the drying mud that once, just the day before, was literally a foraging hotspot. So in speaking of the tolerance to these limiting factors, corixids and chironomids are not only highly preferred for the Great Salt Lake shorebirds, but they're also tolerant of a range of salinity and other conditions, as I've mentioned. So down here we have, they're often listed, these midges, and water boatmen as well, are listed under being very tolerant in many dichotomous keys. But when the wetlands show less extreme swings in dissolved oxygen and temperature and salinity, that's less challenging for various species of macroinvertebrates, and you do find an increased diversity in the prey base. And these are just the ones that happen to be quite common in some of our wetlands of Great Salt Lake, and particularly Gilmore Sanctuary. So, in the end, what we're hoping to accomplish is to develop a macroinvertebrate monitoring protocol to include in the management of Gilmore Sanctuary. And we want to share what we learn with other managers, both around Great Salt Lake and other unique saline and sensitive systems like ours. And we've already started to do that with Salt and Sea by sharing, or actually training them on some of our protocol and helping them develop some of their own protocol and questions of how to address, or how to address some of their questions. And we've initiated a dialogue with the folks at the Lahontan Valley wetlands. We also, with our results, are hoping to provide a diverse habitat settings that maximize macroinvertebrate productivity. And we feel that this is a good way to get there, how to improve our management for the shorebirds. And one thing that has come out of this already is that it's known that there's a certain resiliency toward future threats related to climate change, at least for the macroinvertebrates. And that's only to a certain threshold, I have to say. But the macroinvertebrates of northern temperate regions, such as ours, are better adapted for temperature swings. And they're likely to be more productive. And that's probably a really great thing for shorebirds. That means that there's going to be more generations produced per season, so more food available. And there's obviously caveats behind that, whether there's water and so forth. And then the highly adapted and tolerant species will suit the opportunistic foraging of shorebirds. And those, they already exist in the system. They're part of the community that we have now. So at least those we know we can depend on, at least for a while. And then if water levels or water becomes less available in these rare wetlands, there are species occurring today that are prevalent, and they're the ones that can relocate via flight if areas become dry. Water boatmen can do that. And then also other species that are tolerant of desiccation, drying up. And that's very important characteristics for providing shorebird into the future for these shorebirds that depend on these places that we manage. And finally, I'll share with you some slides, some photos, videos, I'm sorry. And they're not geographic quality, but hopefully you'll get the idea. So about 6 weeks ago, these redneck flower ropes joined us at Unit 1. And there were about 5,000 that day. They were sort of building that week, more and more each day. And so I sampled. And in the first part of the day, they were really, really quite shy. They were as far out as the ones you see in the distance. But if you look closely, they came in very close to me, and they're not just swimming around, they're actually picking at the surface with rapid speed. And what they're getting are crickets that are swimming around and coming up by the surface to get air, and midges that are emerging into their adult form. And they're right there just grabbing them and having a great time. And then finally, we'll leave you at Unit 1 of Gilmore Sanctuary to ponder how many bugs it takes to feed these beautiful flocks of shorebirds.
For a few days every August, the planet travels through a solar stream of dust, grains, pebbles, and rocks. Shooting stars streak across the heavens, fireworks of the universe, marking the Earth's annual passage through the debris-strewn orbit of an ancient comet. When I was a child growing up in Davis County, artificial outdoor lights were nearly non-existent, and I could savor the sweetness of darkness, lit only by the brilliance of stars and moon. I remember extraordinary nights of childhood wonder, sleeping outside on a hot summer night when the heavens unexpectedly filled with falling stars. I did not know then that this was an annual phenomena, and it had a name, the Perseid meteor shower. Many Augusts came and went, and all too soon I had children of my own who had never witnessed a meteor shower. One August, I made plans to take my son Scott to view the shower from the Gar Ranch on Antelope Island. Our plans seemed thwarted when afternoon clouds overcast the sky. But Scott, looking towards the west, saw a tiny patch of blue, and ever the optimist pronounced the sky would soon be clear. When Great Salt Lake water levels are low, a natural sandbar connects the south end of Antelope Island with the mainland. This sandbar repeatedly appears and disappears as lake levels rise and fall. For millennia, whenever the sandbar was flooded, Antelope Island truly became an island. When dry, this route could be traversed by bison, antelope, mice, squirrels, snakes, and Native Americans. Brigham Young used this causeway in the early days of European settlement. This was the route that Scott and I took that August evening. Rather than heeding Scott's hoped-for condition, the late afternoon sky blackened, and wind-driven waves lashed wildly against the sides of the causeway. But then a brief calm descended, and I looked in the distance toward the island and saw strangeness, something I had never before witnessed. All along the distant southern edge of the causeway, for about a mile, all the way out to the island, extending far into the lake and tucked into the cove formed by the gentle curve of Unicorn Point, appeared vast, extensive patches as white as snow. Drawing nearer revealed that the snow, which could not have been snow on a warm August evening, was not. It was thousands and thousands of long-legged shorebirds called avocets, the orange feathers of courting season replaced by the light gray, nearly white feathers avocets wear in winter. Dense patches of tightly packed birds huddled together in the shallow water of the lake. As I scanned these huge flocks with binoculars, I became aware of another strangeness, something eerie and spooky that defied all my many years of experience with avocets. These birds were not randomly oriented as they usually are. Every profile pointed in the same direction. Thousands of upturned bills, all aimed towards the south. The storm hit with a vengeance just as we reached the island. Meteorologists the next day would report it as the storm of the decade. It was as if Tlaloc, the Aztec rain god, had risen in fury, angered by some mortal misdeed against his beloved earth below. Giant thunderbolts hurled zigzag across the sky. Brilliant flashes of lightning spread a mantle of muted tones and soft shadows, briefly illuminating the island hills and valleys. The torrential downpour brought visibility to naught, and we sat immobilized as the remote, rugged dirt road became a lake. Dry but cramped in the car that long night, images of those avocets, not shooting stars, played freely across the landscape of my mind. The next morning, we lingered for a while, but soon returned to the causeway, eager to more leisurely view that absolutely wondrous congregation of avocets. When we returned, we discovered the salty waters of the lake, silent, still, and serene, a mirror reflecting the blueness of the sky above. The avocets were gone as the snows of last winter. Some would say it was the wind that made those birds fade south. But I think they were listening to a summons I could not hear, beckoned by forces I do not comprehend. I gazed to the south at an empty sky. Somewhere beyond, thousands of winged voyagers were flying, fueled by food foraged from the lake, sustaining their flights until they reached their winter destination, probably in the mangrove swamps of Nayarit, Mexico. Migration, the coming and going of birds with the season. If a bird gets the urge for going, it has the wings to carry it far away. And shorebirds come to the lake from far and near, drawn like metal filings to a magnet. Their numbers are incredible. Often counted in the millions. Their flights are spectacular, sometimes lasting thousands of non-stop miles. These wild-winged voyagers do not follow the pathways of the sky haphazardly, nor are they errant wanderers searching for some place to be. Their wings do not beat aimlessly. There is destination in every flap. Birds are guided to the lake for a purpose by powers greater than we are. It was not a song from our lips that set the seasons, the melodies and rhythms to which the wings of birds give heed. The cycles are ancient and have orientation in the sun, the stars, and the earth's magnetic field. Every year, after nesting across Arctic, Canada, and northern United States, shorebirds funnel to Great Salt Lake like grains in a giant hourglass. Some of the largest concentrations of shorebirds on Earth, consuming brine flies, midges, corixids, and other macroinvertebrates. Then once again they disperse to winter, scattered from southern United States to the tip of South America. Those thousands of avocets bid seasonal farewell to Great Salt Lake. Like the snows of the winter, they are gone, not forever, but for only a little while. Gone until the hand of spring flips the hourglass over and they funnel back to the lake once again. Avocets take leave on wings of buoyant hope, leaving the lake behind in our care, depending on us to protect it. The lake, their destiny, their critical link to life. How sweet is flight as we're rising, how fertile the lake left behind. May it always remain and sustain us through eternal cycles of here and then gone.